Well, hello, Miss Urso. Today's guest is Kaitlin Urso, who is with the Department of Public Health and Environment through Colorado. She has 9 years of technical environmental experience in mechanical engineering degree from the University of Colorado. And in her role, she provides free environmental assistance to cannabis and brewing companies. Welcome to the show, Kaitlin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I might have butchered a little bit of your experience, but it sounds like you are a mechanical engineer by trade. Tell us a little bit about that and how you got involved with environmental sustainability initiatives.
Sure. So, my formal education is mechanical engineering at the University of Colorado. But when I graduated, my passions didn't really align with my degree. With mechanical engineering here in Colorado, a lot of the opportunities at the time I graduated were mostly in the oil and gas industries or, working for large manufacturers. And it just wasn't really what I was passionate about. And so I pursued environmentalism. And so, I ended up working for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, which is wonderful because I still apply a lot of the technical skills that I acquired with my degree to my current job. So my current role is to basically be a free environmental consultant for all small businesses in Colorado. I primarily currently assist craft breweries and cannabis industries, mostly because those are emerging small business clusters here in Colorado that, maybe they don't trigger environmental regulations, but they still have environmental impacts. And so anything I can do to help these industries understand what their environmental impacts are and what the best management practices are that they can put in place to reduce those impacts, which will simultaneously have benefits for their business, like saving them money.
Fantastic. There's a lot of need on the cannabis side, and there's a lot of lack of information. So it's great that you're available as a resource. And perhaps we can start with step one, seed to sale. Where do you feel that cannabis is doing a good job in terms of the environment, and where do you feel that we have some lessons to learn or room to grow in terms of being more sustainable and more environmentally friendly?
Yeah, so you got to look at the different markets and the way that cannabis was legalized. The way that cannabis was legalized here in Colorado is very different from how it was legalized in California, with the majority of grows in Colorado being indoor grows versus in California, marijuana and cannabis is primarily grown outdoors. So there's a varying landscape of environmental impacts. And so, speaking from a Colorado standpoint, some of the things that we got right with having indoor grows also created some issues. So, when we legalized, a lot of our regulations were really focused on safety and security and no diversion to the black market. And with the way that the regulations were set up, it concentrated most of the bulk of the market, about 60% of the market, into Denver proper. And so we have this large concentration of indoor grows in a small area in our state. So that kind of creates unique impacts in that they're all using electricity from our power grid for their grow lights and to power their HVAC systems. They're all using the municipal drinking water supply to irrigate the crops and, water. And then they're all, releasing that same water into the wastewater treatment system as part of our municipal systems. And so the impacts that we have here in Colorado, as far as the environment is concerned, are very different than, in California, where you have an outdoor landscape and, you're a lot more concerned with erosion and land contamination and proper permitting in certain areas and things like that versus, here in Colorado, it's a lot more controlled impacts with it being indoors.
Is the environmental footprint easier if it's an outdoor grow, or is it just unique and different with each scenario?
That's a good question. And I go back and forth on it. When I first started studying the environmental impacts of cannabis, I was maybe naive in my thinking, and I thought, oh, Colorado really got it wrong. And if we could just grow out, if outdoor growing was more accessible, we would use less energy because we'd be using the power of the sun and, some certain other things, and we'd be spread out. And so that we're not having this, large concentration of grows right down in our downtown city center, things like that. But then when I go out to California, and I've been to a few conferences out there now and learn about the environmental impacts that your state is dealing with, and I almost think like, wow, we're lucky in that our problems are simplified. With it being outdoors, it's a lot more harder to control those impacts. It's a lot harder to keep track of it. I mean, even just accessibility for inspectors, it's a lot easier to have a compliant market with inspections when everybody's, has an address and is right, in one area versus, when you guys are spread out all over the state and in rural areas. And the permitting and compliance is maybe not as easily as enforced or followed. And like I said, you can have more land contamination issues. And maybe, like I said, it's just a little bit harder to track. So I would say different is a good way to put it. It's just different, unique concerns that come from each market. And so I think that the best thing that cannabis businesses can do is just educate themselves on the environmental impacts of their business and learn what they can do to better manage the resources that they use as inputs, to their business.
Right. So obviously, cannabis is a plant that uses a lot of resources. How does it compare to some other vegetation in terms of water intake, for example?
It depends, again, on the growing situation and how it's grown. So, if you're growing in an indoor cultivation environment, you're typically growing hydroponically and you're shortening the life cycle of the plant. And typically, with the way that nutrients are delivered, there's more of a practice of overwatering. It can be up to 50% overwatering to make sure that plant's receiving the proper nutrients. But it can also, depending on grow practices, be more efficient with having drip irrigation systems that are very accurately and precise watering to exactly what the plant needs are. So again, it kind of varies what those practices are at the end of the day. But it's a water resource intensive process, and especially indoor or outdoor controlled environment, you're going to be using a lot of water, and a lot of times like I said, the nutrients are going to be delivered through the water system as well. And so, not only are we adding, potential pesticide runoff into these water systems, but also, the nutrient load that again is then being either in an outdoor system being, washed away and runoff and could have potential land contamination issues if it's being, over fertilized, or in an indoor environment, that's just more of a load that our wastewater municipality has to treat to make sure the safety, meet safety standards and water treatment standards.
So are there any major efforts to repurpose the water that's used within the cannabis plantations, or is that pretty much being run off and being put into
so
the waste
like I
system?
said, it goes to our wastewater municipalities and it gets treated like any other runoff, and so that it can be reused and up to safety standards. But the best thing like a business can do for water efficiency is having that precise automated watering. A lot of cannabis facilities will treat the incoming water before it's given to the plants. Some of the good practices for treating that water would be with UV light or with ozone or with carbon filters. One of the practices that we kind of discourage is using reverse osmosis, because that can create almost 50% water to waste just right off the bat because of the way that system works. And so we really encourage, cannabis businesses to really look at the quality of their water before they do more treatment, and then having really efficient water management plans, whether it's indoor or outdoor grow, so that we're being just resource efficient and resource conscious.
Now, the cultivators are treating the water so strictly because of the quality of the end product. Is that what they're trying to control, or is there other reasons for
Yeah,
that?
they're trying to control the quality of the water that comes into contact with the plants, because especially in a hydroponic environment, that the water is a big part of the growing process. And so they want to make sure that they have, don't have any contaminants in there. They'll want to make sure that it doesn't have high levels of chlorine, things like that, so that it's just a really good, pure base to start with. And then they add nutrients in so that the plant gets exactly what it needs. But for example, here in Colorado, we have a lot of naturally occurring nutrients in our water already. And so if a system if a cultivation is treating their water before they feed it to plants, I mean, my best recommendation is to test the water first, know what's in it, because, if you just remove all the nutrients and then pay for more nutrients to add back in, it's less efficient than knowing what's in your water currently and then supplementing what the plants need from there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so test the water first. Now, how does hemp compare to marijuana in terms of its thirst?
Here in Colorado, hemp is mostly grown outdoors, and marijuana is grown mostly indoors. And so for hemp, they can use, they'll have different sources of water. And in Colorado, there's actually a new rule that allows for hemp to be irrigated with reclaimed water. So that is water that's not necessarily treated to drinking water standards for human consumption, but it's treated to a standard that it's classified as reclaimed water. And so basically this, it's cheaper water essentially, and it's not up to drinking water standards, but it's been deemed suitable for hemp cultivation. It's up for debate, I think, next year as if that water will be allowed in indoor marijuana grows or not. There's just added levels of concern when you bring that water into an indoor environment, because if it, has any bacteria or anything like that, it just is more prone to be a problem in an indoor environment versus outdoor.
Interesting. Do we have an estimate of how much water is required to grow a single plant to maturity?
I do not know that statistic.
Okay.
It'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah, interesting. All right. And are there any cultivators right now that have a completely closed system, meaning that they take their own water, treat it, and then feed it to the plants again?
I'm sure that system exists. I have not seen it myself. More of the traditional system that we've seen is, like I said, using the drinking water, regular water supply from the city water as the influent, and then, draining the effluent to, again, the wastewater municipality, and not necessarily recycling in-house. But I do know that is a practice that's done where, they'll recollect the runoff water, make sure that it has correct nutrients in it, and then, refeed that water back in.
Okay. Now, we talked a lot about nutrients and also potential bacteria that might be introduced through the reclaimed water. Is there any more sustainable ways to feed the plants nutrients and also treat the potential for bugs?
Yeah, so again, in the water treatment systems in-house at the facility, good ones that, are commonly used are UV lights, which, kill bacteria. Ozone, which kills many bacteria and viruses and also adds a high oxygen content to the water, which is good for the plants. We've seen carbon filters in the water systems as well, which will also pull out any bacteria or things like that could be any contamination in the water. And so, those are good treatment options. And then I would say for efficiency wise, making sure that there's just precise and automated fertigation systems that's only feeding the plants, exactly what they need, measuring the nutrient doses, varying the nutrient dosing along with plant age. And so you're, exactly knowing what the plants need and just not overdoing it. And if you are going to overwater, if you're typically overwatering by 50%, can you bring that overwatering down to 20%? And just, continue to evolve and become more resource efficient is the best advice I have.
Now, those watering benchmarks, do they exist somewhere, or how can cultivators find out about what's an appropriate amount of water to use?
Because the cannabis industry is so new, this is an emerging, area of interest, and there's quite a few efforts out there that are being established to help inform data behind this, and encouraging cultivators to voluntarily share their data. One of the efforts that it's in draft form right now, but we can share it with you guys is cannabisbigdata.co/blooming dash benchmark. That's one of those efforts where cannabis businesses can share their environmental metrics, how much energy they use, how much water they use, how much waste they create compared to how much marijuana they grow. And so we can start to establish those benchmarks and trends for the industry.
Fabulous, fantastic. Now, do you advise cultivators on pesticide utilization or fertilization? Is that something that you cover?
No, that's typically through the Department of Agriculture.
Okay. So
They're the
even
ones who regulate that.
so, even though they do have an environmental impact, that's not something really that falls within the auspices of what you work with.
Right. I mean, really the only, thing that we kind of address is the fact that when pesticides are in use, that they can end up in the water and in the runoff, there's a potential impact from that. But the extent of what pesticides are used and how they're used and the amount and how they're managed and all of that is through the Department of Agriculture.
And is there like a dedicated person that advises or consults with the growers on pesticide usage or fertilization?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I could definitely try to find you that contact.
Okay, awesome. Well, if it exists, we'll definitely include it in the show notes in case someone is interested and would like more information. All right, fantastic. So that was one aspect, obviously, of the environmental impact of the plant. What are some of the other environmental impacts that the plant has that you guys monitor or consult with?
Sure. So one of the impacts that I'm most excited about, researching, just because it's something that hasn't traditionally been discussed or thought about, is the air impacts. A lot of people are talking about the energy impacts of the industry, just because energy is very costly and it ends up having a lot of air quality impacts as a secondary impact, just because we still burn natural resources to get the majority of our energy, and the majority of areas. And then a lot of people talk about the water impacts because it's tangible, and you can measure it. A lot of waste impacts, but non-traditionally people aren't really talking about the air quality impacts. And so one of the things I'm interested in researching is, so as the plants grow, the marijuana plants, as they grow, they release terpenes. Terpenes are responsible for the traditional marijuana odor that we all associate with marijuana. Well, those terpenes are volatile organic compounds, and volatile organic compounds are ozone precursors. And so you have this chemical reaction that happens in the atmosphere when volatile organic compounds come in contact with nitrogen oxide emissions, which are from combustion emissions. So our cars, our power plants, anytime we're burning things in a boiler or in an engine, those types of emissions. So when volatile organic compounds mix with nitrogen oxide compounds in our atmosphere in the presence of sunlight, they form ground level ozone. Ground level ozone is a pollutant. It's toxic for us to breathe. It also has environmental impacts. For instance, when plants are exposed to high levels of ozone, they kind of turn brown and almost, it looks like they're rusting or being bruised. And so it's an interesting thing, as I mentioned before, in Colorado, when we legalized marijuana the way we legalized, it created, pockets of concentrated markets. And so about 60% or more of the industry is concentrated in the Denver, metro area, which is also the area of our state that we're not meeting the health standards for ozone. And so we're really interested to know that, any new source of VOCs in the area can react with the current levels of nitrogen oxide to form new ozone. And so what hasn't been studied in the past is what is the VOC emission rate of the marijuana plants as they grow? So how many pounds of VOCs are released into the atmosphere per pound of marijuana grown? That's an unknown question. Once we're able to answer that question, we can then look at, okay, what is the current composition of our air quality in Colorado, and what is the resulting impact on ozone? And then ultimately be able to answer the question of the total ozone, contributors in our state, how much is the cannabis industry, compared to other, large sources of contributing factors for ozone? That is a good question. I don't think that technology exists, but it would be really cool if it did.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. And what, I guess, stage in the growing and collection process exposes the environment to the most amount of terpenes released?
Really, if you think about, the cultivation and the smells associated with it, and so as the plants mature and the flowers get more mature and they grow, that's really where you're going to get most of the terpene concentrations coming off the plant. However, in the process of harvesting that plant and trimming it down and, drying it and cutting it all up and putting it into different product categories like forming joints or extracting it, that whole process of taking it from, out of the ground through processing to get those end products in the store, that can also have a significant amount of terpene concentrations. I mean, if you just think about, a flower growing and you just go up to it and you smell it, you smell it more when it's growing. But if you were to, pick that flower and rub it all over your hands, that smell would probably become more concentrated because it's releasing the terpenes within the plant. And so we are seeing more terpene emissions associated with the processing of the plants than the actual cultivation of the plants. But the study results will be published summer of next year. So we're really excited. We have collected all of the study samples. We conducted the study at 4 cultivation facilities here in Colorado, 2 really, larger warehouse grows, one more medium size, and then 1 small cultivation. So we're really excited to see those results. But it's worth noting that the cannabis industry has already kind of solved this issue on their own with their odor control practices. So carbon filters are commonly used to control odors, especially at indoor marijuana cultivations. And carbon filters will actually trap the VOCs, the terpenes that end up forming ozone within the carbon filters, so they're not released into the environment. So that practice of controlling the odor is actually controlling the VOCs. And so, this issue, although, it may end up being, we don't know the extent of the issue because that's what we're trying to quantify. It's worth noting that best management practices have already caught up to this issue for odor, and a lot of cultivations here in Colorado already have carbon filtration in place, which is solving the problem. And, we really just try to encourage those cultivators to have best management practices for those carbon filters to make them as efficient as possible. So, for instance, what that looks like is having, temperature and humidity within very specific ranges at the cultivation to control the amount of VOCs, because as temperature increases, you're going to have more VOCs and more odor emitted. And then as humidity rises, humidity kind of dunks up the filter and makes it so those pores in the filter aren't available to absorb the VOCs. Another common mistake that we see with carbon filtration is exceeding the flow rate through the filter. So there's a lot of heat and humidity that these HVAC systems at indoor cultivations are trying to control. So a lot of times the HVAC systems are working overtime and at really high capacities and flow rates. Well, if you exceed the flow rate through that carbon filter, the VOCs don't have the enough contact time to be absorbed within the pores of the filter, and it's basically just blowing them all through. And so knowing these factors can really help a cultivation manage their carbon filtration system in a way that has the most impact on VOC removal for the best public health outcomes.
Interesting. So you want a cooler, drier environment.
Yep. Exactly. And then, when you have your carbon filters, oftentimes it's a practice to only change their filters out maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. Whatever it is, we encourage cultivators to have that replacement schedule, have a new filter put in May, because ozone season is May through September here in Colorado, because the third ingredient is sunlight, and that's when the sun's shining the most, in our summer months, May through September. So as filter efficiency drops off, maybe in the winter, it's not as big of an impact on ozone formation, because you don't have that added factor of sunlight.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned you also work with the craft beer industry. Are these problems that they also tackle, and have they been able to successfully handle some of these issues as well?
Yeah, so talking about from an air quality standpoint, how the brewing industry impacts air quality, and from a VOC standpoint, as they produce alcohol, that's ethanol, and ethanol is a volatile organic compound. So any beer that is lost in the packaging process, and it ends up evaporating, becomes volatile organic compound emissions. And so in working with the craft brewing industry, some of the best things that we've done is make recommendations about how they can be more efficient in their packaging processes, and throughout their brewing process, to make sure that they're wasting no beer, so that it doesn't end up as air emissions. Also, from a water standpoint too, we've advised the craft brewing industry on how they can be more water efficient, because brewing beer is actually a pretty water intensive process. Depending on the brewery, it can be 6 to 8 barrels of water per barrel of beer brewed. I mean, it can be a pretty high ratio. And so to bring that ratio down, again, we really try to encourage water efficiency throughout the brewing process. And a lot of the water use goes into packaging too. So, one of the best recommendations that we ended up making for the brewing industry is, imagine a packaging line where you've got glass bottles of beer being filled. And so the first step in that would be a sterilized rinse of the inside of the bottle to make sure that it's clean and ready to receive beer. Then it gets filled up with beer and capped. Well, in that filling process, there's always going to be some overfill. And so the third step is to wash that beer off the outside of the bottle, so it's not sticky for packaging, right? Well, you don't need to use the external rinse does not need to be sterile. And so to encourage water efficiency in packaging lines, one of the greatest things that we saw was reusing the internal rinse water, capturing that instead of having it go down the drain, and then reusing it as the external rinse for the packaging, because that doesn't need to be sterile. And so it reuses, it doubles your water efficiency on your packaging line, but just being smart and thinking about, how you can reuse that water, and the fact that the internal rinse, needs to be sterile, but doesn't become that contaminated, and that water is definitely clean enough to do an external bottle rinse after the packaging line.
Interesting. Very cool. So, are there other, I guess, critical resources that can be managed better that the industry is not looking at, that you would suggest looking in that direction?
I think the waste streams for the cannabis industry are another opportunity for resource efficiency. There's multiple waste streams coming out of the industry, and one of it, is being the amount of plant waste that's coming out of the industry. And here in Colorado, and I believe the same is in California too, that marijuana plant waste has to be mixed 50% with non-marijuana waste before it can leave the licensed facility to be disposed of. That rule was made with the intent of decreasing diversion to the black market. Basically, they didn't want people recovering marijuana trash and trying to repurpose it. And so the intent of the rule was, decreasing diversion. But what it essentially does is it doubles our waste footprint. And these marijuana businesses are having to, most of this waste is going to the landfill unless they can produce enough organic, 50% organic, other, non-marijuana waste to mix with their waste stream in order to be able to compost it. So that's definitely an area where there's opportunity. Here in Colorado. We now allow stalks and stems to be exempt from that 50-50 waste rule if they're going to be recycled for industrial fibers. So that's a waste efficiency. And, as far as innovation goes, we're also looking into the viability of using on-site anaerobic digestion for plant waste so that we can reuse some of the commodities that are produced in that waste breaking down. So when the plant waste breaks down, it releases methane and CO2. If that's done in an anaerobic digester in a controlled environment, that methane can be reused as a commodity and burned as a fuel for either electrical generation or for heat. And then the CO2 can be compressed and used for CO2 extraction or released into a supplemental to supplement the grow environment. To increase the CO2 concentration in the room. And then, there's a byproduct of nutrient-rich fertilizer, which could be, land applied, possibly. And so, there's different ways of managing our waste streams. And I think that we need to continue to look at new opportunities and have our options evolve, basically. Other waste streams to consider from the cannabis industry are post-consumer. So after your consumer purchases your products from a store and goes home with all that packaging waste, and how that packaging waste is managed, and is it recyclable, and how is it recyclable, and is it easy access to recycling? One of the new regulations that we have here in Colorado, which I'm excited about to take effect January of next year, is to allow dispensaries to now have take-back programs for their packaging waste, so that consumers, after they, for instance, you buy a joint and you go home and you open up all the packaging, the little plastic tube that the joint comes in can now be taken back to the store. Upon your next visit, maybe you get some loyalty points or some incentive for bringing that packaging back. And then that packaging is sent off to be sterilized, have the label removed, then returns to the facility to be reused, and which brings packaging costs down for the dispensary. It creates customer loyalty for bringing them back to the store. And ultimately, too, it creates this reuse economy for what would ultimately be packaging waste that would either need to be, sent to a recycling facility would be the hopes. But ultimately, a lot of times the reality is it's going to landfill. And so by having these take back programs, we're really excited to see, this move the needle on innovation and how we manage cannabis waste streams.
Do you feel that it's possible to address that packaging issue through regulation, meaning require less packaging? Or do you feel that that's going to be part of the regulations forever in terms of, making it childproof, et cetera?
I think there's absolutely opportunities to, move the needle on regulatory requirements for packaging waste. But I think there's also, a delicate balance there too, because really the intent or the reason why we have a lot of the packaging waste is, like you mentioned, childproof packaging laws and making sure that there's safety there for the youth. And, some would argue that we don't have childproof packaging for liquor or for cigarettes, and we rely on responsible adult use. However, marijuana walks in two realms of recreational and medical. And however, we do have childproof packaging for a lot of medical products that are out there. And so I definitely see both sides to the issue. And I think there's definitely room for evolution of the regulations, but at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of innovation coming out of the packaging industries, and that they're becoming a lot more efficient in meeting these childproof packaging requirements in a smaller footprint or in a smaller package, and still being able to meet the labeling requirements and things like that. So it's really, this becoming more efficient with our packaging, I think is both two-sided. Our regulations should evolve, but at the same time, our packaging economy should evolve, and really making sure that we're meeting the intent of the regulations and providing a safe environment for consumers, but at the same time, not creating this excess waste. And so we're seeing a lot of progress here in Colorado in being able to do take back programs. That's also now going to be available for vape cartridges, which were traditionally hard to recycle due to the trace amounts of marijuana product left in them. But those will now be allowed to be taken back to dispensaries too to be recycled. We're seeing, like I said, evolution of packaging, and that packagers are using new materials too. We're seeing more hemp plastics available on the market, which hemp plastics, they're from a more renewable source, and also they biodegrade a lot quicker. And so the lifespan of that packaging, if it does in the landfill, is much shorter. We're also seeing, some innovations in reusing ocean plastics. I've heard of folks trying to experiment too with doing, paper-based, hemp-based packages that still meet all the labeling and childproof requirements. And so I think the industry has a ways to go, but they're evolving quickly. I think that the cannabis industry is responding quickly to these concerns and addressing them. And I think the best thing that we can all do is educate ourselves on the waste streams and become, creative and work together, whether it's a regulatory route or through innovation to make the industry more sustainable.
Great. Now you mentioned hemp plastics. Is it possible to make hemp plastics from the biomass that's recovered post-extraction, or does it have to be harvested in a completely different manner?
That's a good question. I've heard from a lot of folks that because the first step into extraction is to basically grind up the plants and macerate the plant material so that the most surface area comes into contact with the solvent or whatever extraction method you're using, so you can get the most cannabinoids per plant mass out. And because of that maceration and that, basically grinding down of plant material to prepare it for extraction, that I've heard that a lot of times that damages the fibers so that they can't be reused for a lot of purposes. Now, I'm not sure if that is a barrier to plastics or if it's just a barrier to other industrial, uses. I think that it really depends on the end market and what the needs of the fibers are and the fiber size.
So clearly making fabric out of the residue seems to be not the best way to use the.
Yeah, I've heard, for fabric, like for hemp fabrics and cotton, like more like cotton material and things like that you need longer fibers. And so you really do need to grow industrial hemp that is specifically bred to have those long fibers in order to get that product out of it.
How about hempcrete? Have you seen any companies be able to make that successfully, and what does that look like?
We're seeing more into like R&D and experimental type things for hempcrete. I have not seen any, large scale companies pop up. And on that subject, I haven't really seen a lot of industrial hemp fiber companies pop up in Colorado. What we're mostly seeing is hemp being grown for CBD extraction in that market, probably just because of the larger profit margins. But I would like to see, and I think there will be, more of an evolution of industrial hemp purposes. It's just, market forces catching up. And so, I'd like to see more of that industrial fiber market because it is a really great, sustainable resource and great sustainable industrial fiber, commodity.
Okay. Now, hemp plant has been used for bioremediation. What are some of the concerns in terms of, I guess, growing it for bioremediation purposes? Is that done? And then is the final product thrown away if that's done?
Well, I think that, there just needs to be extra caution taken for bioremediation. So one characteristic to be aware of with hemp is it has a really high uptake rate and it has a high bioaccumulation within the plant. And so basically it's like a really good sponge. So whatever is in the land, it's going to absorb into the body of the plant. And so, if you're trying to remediate soil or pull heavy metals out of the soil or pull contamination, even if it's radioactive materials out of the soil, it's a really great plant to do that. However, within the fibers, within the plant, those contaminants are going to be contained. And so you just have to be aware of what is the end use of that commodity of that plant. And so if it's going to industrial fibers, if it's going to hempcrete, or if it's going to be used, for making cloth or whatever, if it's not going to be used for human consumption, that's less of a concern versus, if those plants are planted on contaminated land and then being extracted used for the CBD market. When you're concentrating down the cannabinoids out of the plant, you're also concentrating down any potential contaminants. And so, and there's also there's actually no testing standards for in product hemp commodities right now besides potency of THC. And so, it's a concern that's out there, but there's not a lot of regulations around it yet.
Interesting. So, based on the new regulations, if a marijuana plant tests too high for pesticides, what's happening with that batch of plant material? Is it ending up in a landfill, or is it getting repurposed, or do we know what happens to it?
From my understanding,
I think I lost you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we just lost you for a minute. Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay. So as far as, if a end product fails residual tests, for pesticides, for molds, depending on what it is, there's certain protocols that it has to go through, depending on, from my understanding, if it's not meeting pesticide standards, it has to go to the waste stream, being that mixed 50% with non-marijuana waste and disposed of out the door. Depending on which tests, if the product fails, I know there are some options to send it to extraction because that contaminant won't transfer through an extraction versus if you left it as flower.
Okay, so there are things
but that's kind of out of the realm of my expertise because that's sort of going beyond environmental.
Got it. So there are things that are being done, but it looks like there's a lot of room for improvement and growth.
Yeah. And I think we just all need to keep in mind that this is a brand new industry. Colorado was the first to legalize. And, early on, we learned a lot of regulatory lessons pretty quickly, like, our labeling standards, for instance, our potency standards for dosing, having all edibles be labeled with, THC very clearly. And so there was a lot of evolution of regulations early on in marijuana, and I would say that that's still happening. It's to a lesser degree. You don't see these big wide sweeping impacts, but there's still constant evolution of regulations. Some of the things that I mentioned that Colorado is doing that's taking effect in January with our take back programs. We also have some regulations that make composting a little bit more accessible. And so we're constantly reevaluating our industry, our environmental impacts, kind of our regulatory landscape, and looking at, okay, how can we keep the intent of these rules, but evolve them so that they don't have these unforeseen impacts. And so as other states legalize, I would just encourage basically what we're doing today, communication and learning about what other states are doing and finding solutions and sharing information and having grows voluntarily share with us what their environmental metrics are and impacts so that we can all learn and grow together and make a more sustainable industry. I think that the marijuana industry has a really good opportunity to grow itself sustainably from the start. And even though each state has kind of legalized in pockets and we all have different regulatory requirements, at the end of the day, we should all be striving for having the most sustainable industry that we can, being that we create the most amount of high quality product with the least amount of resources. and anything we can do to help each other get there along the way, so that when and if, federal legalization does hit, the current markets are positioned to be models for a more sustainable future for the rest of the country.
Awesome. Is there any, I guess, resources that people can turn to in terms of websites or groups to learn more about sustainable practices?
Yeah, so if you go, the state's website is colorado.gov/CDPHE/green cannabis. That's where you can find all of our state environmental cannabis resources. That webpage is constantly evolving as well. And then also Denver's website, which is, one second, I want to make sure I tell you it right. It's denvergov.org/cannabis sustainability. And so that's another great resource where you can find actually really detailed guides on environmental impacts of cannabis and best management practices. So, that's a great website to learn all about, what are the air quality impacts, energy impacts, water impacts, waste impacts, and what are the best management practices that people can implement to make improvements.
Great. As far as you know, are there any city governments or state governments that are, I guess, helping with sustainability efforts within the cannabis market, or is that something that's still too new and no one's jumped in yet?
I would say, being from Colorado and working for the state government, I could say that at a state level, it's certainly becoming a growing priority for us. And we're, trying to divert more resources and create more robust programs to encourage a more sustainable market here in Colorado. So that's an ongoing effort and priority for us. At the city level, Denver County is very active in cannabis sustainability and puts out the annual best management practices guide. They have an annual cannabis sustainability symposium. They're very active in it as well. I know that in Massachusetts, their Cannabis Control Commission also has sustainability is a high emphasis. And so they do a lot to encourage sustainable practices in their market. And so, there's definitely pockets of efforts across the country. I would say that, Colorado being the most mature market, we're probably leading the way in cannabis environmental outreach and education. But we're also happy to collaborate with other states. Michigan, for instance, has new guidance out about all the environmental impacts of cannabis, and includes resources for where folks in their state can find out more. And so we are seeing, and even at the level of the trade organization, the National Cannabis Industry Association, we're beginning to see that cannabis sustainability, environmentalism, is an emphasis and a priority for them as well. So I just think that this is a growing trend within the industry, and that it makes sense too that as more competition comes into the market, people just need to become more resource efficient, and competition grows. And so this is just a really, another competitive advantage for the business, as well as taking the social responsibility of being resource efficient and taking care of our planet, and being good community actors, and only using what we need to produce the products that make us money as a business.
Right. Where do you think is the biggest area of opportunity in terms of improving sustainability to a large extent for most of the cannabis businesses?
Here in Colorado, I can definitely say that would be in the way of energy efficiency, because, again, we primarily grow indoors, and the amount of energy it takes to run the lights and the HVAC systems, which are competing priorities. The lights, if they're traditional lights, LED lights don't have this as much of a problem of heat generation, but the traditional growing lights certainly put off a tremendous amount of heat. And so then the HVAC system is fighting that heat as well. Plus you have all the humidity of the plants, transpiring and things like that. And so it's really just a really high energy intense energy industry. And so, I think that that's the low hanging fruit for the industry to tackle. At least here in Colorado, is becoming more energy efficient, whether that's through the evolution of lighting technologies, using less energy and also putting off less heat. That's it, taking into account more innovation in the way that we manage our grow systems and the way that we manage our combined heat and power at the cultivations, and really looking at the cultivation as a whole system and not just independently looking at the lights and the HVAC system, and really creating a system that all works together. I think that's probably our low-hanging fruit here in Colorado, is their impacts.
Interesting. Are there any cultivators that you know of that might be using solar energy to supplement their grow conditions?
I have heard of a few that are using solar energy to supplement and offset their energy loads. However, it's pretty hard to for an indoor cultivation to do 100% offset with renewable energy. It's just the footprint and the energy use is pretty high. So low footprint space-wise and high energy load. And so although they might be supplementing with renewable energy, we haven't seen, or at least I haven't seen, any that are solely renewable energy, at least that are indoor grows. We are kind of seeing this trend more to, greenhouse hybrids, where it's an indoor cultivation environment, but maybe they're taking advantage of more sunlight through, sun tubes or things like that.
Oh, fabulous. So it looks like there is a lot of room for sustainability practices within the industry. It looks like the industry is young, but definitely sustainability practices are at their infancy currently. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, I'd say they're at their infancy, and but yet they're really obtainable. So when any cannabis business is looking at incorporating sustainability into their practices, it shouldn't be seen as this like insurmountable goal. There's lots of small things that really add up of, practices that can be put in place. And I always tell people, behavioral changes are free, and a lot of environmental efficiencies can be achieved just through best practices and changing the way that we do things. And so really just being informed about the resources that go into your cultivation and how you can be more resource efficient with them. One of the best examples I can give is space utilization, especially within an indoor cultivation environment, having rolling benches so that you don't need to have aisleways in between every row of plants. So you can kind of part the seas and work in one aisleway so that you can condense your grow space and have as much light canopy utilization as possible and space utilization. You're going to get more product out using less light. You're going to have less of an HVAC load than if you were, overlighting your space.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that was a lot of great information. We'll go ahead and make sure to include all the websites they mentioned on the show notes. Any last comments or suggestions for the audience?
No, I would just say thank you all for taking the time to listen and to make sustainability a priority. When making any sustainable decision, the main thing to keep in mind is we have three goals. We want to do what's good for people. We want to do what's good for profit. We want to do what's good for the planet. And so in making any sustainable business decision, we want to make sure that we're meeting the goals of all three of those priorities, and give yourself the time and space to know that sustainability is an iterative process, and it's an evolution, and it doesn't all need to happen overnight or from the start, and that it can be constant learning and constantly improving the way that you do things, so that we have the most robust and sustainable cannabis market that we can have.
Fantastic. Well, Kaitlin, thank you for all your time and information. This is an evolving conversation, and I hope that we can bring you back on the show to continue talking about some other innovations in the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.